So it's been roughly a year since Sonic Frontiers dropped. I was originally going to talk about this game as soon as it came out, but I later decided to hold off on that and see if Sega was going to add any touch-ups or at the very least follow through with the support that it announced shortly after it was released. With a few patch updates, consistent support from Sega, and a massive DLC update on the horizon, I say now is a good time to finally talk about this game as sort of a follow-up to a video I made a while back, which basically laid out some goals Sega should achieve if the game was going to break any ground. Now, before I played Frontiers, my initial thoughts had low expectations. Not because of what was shown off in the earlier demos, which was questionable considering how odd the execution was, but more so because Sonic has been catching a number of L's when it comes to his games. Forces was lukewarm at best, colors made it feel like it needed more time in the oven, and the original Origins collection left more to be desired. So given the recent track record, I say it's pretty understandable as to why many people like myself needed to keep the expectations low, especially since Sonic Frontiers was shaping up to be a pretty big game, and seeing the company bite off more than they can chew is definitely something they've done before. However, after I played Frontiers during its initial release and sometime later after it gained support from Sega, Frontiers for the first time in a while felt like a genuine attempt at making a competent Sonic title, while figuring out a way to build on top of what they've already established to provide fans with a brand new experience. First, let's start with the story. Not so much the actual story for the game, as I don't want to spoil any of that, but rather what you can expect from it. I don't go into these Sonic games expecting some kind of deep level storytelling that you would see in more story driven games, but what I do expect at the very least is a shonen style tale that does not hit too hard on the nose and isn't afraid to take a serious tone when it's needed. And Sonic games have delivered stories like these before. We've seen that with Gamma's story from SA1 and especially in SA2 when we dive deeper into Shadow's backstory. I bring all this up because unlike stories we've gained post Sonic Unleashed, Frontiers takes a more serious tone in its writing that matches the same energy we would have gotten during the adventure era. While it does retain a level of lightheartedness, it won't ham up the story with some needless slapstick or corny jokes like Baldy McNosehair. All of the characters that appear in this game are written pretty well, with one character in particular getting a much needed redemption arc after everything it's been through. And if you've kept up with the series as much as I have, you may have an inkling on who that is. This is all thanks to Ian Flynn, who, in case you don't know, is the main writer for the Archie Sonic comics during its final issues and continued writing for Sonic in the IDW comics. This is a writer who understands these characters and knows exactly what to do with them, plus he is no stranger to putting these characters in a more serious setting. With the type of story Frontiers wants to tell, he's the man for the job. Now, I'm well aware that not everyone's going to be on the same page with the story having more of a serious tone and would prefer that slapstick side of things. But seeing Sonic and company return to this style of writing is not only refreshing, but it's also something that should have been sooner when Forces became a thing. That is going to be a topic for another day. But how does Sonic Frontiers hold up as a game? Frontiers takes a different approach by putting the blue blur into a more sandbox-like environment, which Sega has classified as open zones. In case you've never played a sandbox title before, players generally romp around in a large environment where they're able to take on missions, activities, and find collectibles while powering up their character. This same concept is also done in open world games, but the big difference between the two of them is that sandbox types will take place in one giant area with clear boundaries, while the open world types are seamless and typically have little to no boundaries at all. That's why in the case of Frontiers, it feels more appropriate to say that the game falls under the sandbox category. Sonic himself will visit 5 of these open zones, and within them he'll be able to find new collectibles, take on missions which will reveal more areas on the map, fight various enemies ranging from your usual fodder to elites, and take on the cyberworld challenges which are tucked away in these portals. Each of these open zones are larger sandboxes, as I stated earlier, giving Sonic plenty of room to stretch his legs and roam as free as he sees fit. Each of these open zones are filled with structures that resembles some kind of ruin, and as more of these zones open up, Sonic will go from only seeing what's on the surface to being able to fully explore these mysterious structures that lie deeper or in some cases above land. Now, I should warn you that unlike previous entries, Sonic handles very differently here. While he's using the boost formula that was first introduced back in Unleashed, the way the Hedgehog handles in Frontiers has been changed significantly to fit the physics engine this game uses. So if you were practicing on older titles, it may not do you any good here, but it's perfect for those who hadn't played these games in a hot minute. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to be using a PlayStation controller to describe the button layout, despite most of the footage coming off of the PC version of the game. For starters, Sonic's homing attack has moved back to the square button just like how it was in Unleashed. At first, I was not too thrilled about that, because both the homing attack and the boost shared the exact same button. But to my surprise, Sega remembered that multiple buttons exist and mapped the boost to the R2 trigger instead. This is a welcome change because not only my thumb is free to hit the other buttons while I'm boosting, but now I can attack enemies without accidentally boosting off of a cliff. I imagine this was done because Sonic's melee attacks are also mapped to square, so players don't need to worry about switching to another button after the homing attack was used. Sonic also has his double jump from colors, and he even has access to his drop spin, which was first established in Mania. The move itself is pretty handy as it will always put Sonic at his top speed when it's used. Now Sonic's Lightspeed Dash does make a return, however it is mapped to the L3 button instead of triangle. This is because the Hedgehog has access to a new move called the Side Loop. Whenever the triangle button is held down, Sonic will leave behind a trail where players will be able to draw a circle. Doing so will cause a number of things to happen, like spawning rings and sometimes other collectibles, activating switches, or sending enemies flying, which is useful for disabling shields. Also, here's a neat trick. If the player draws a figure 8, they will get an infinite supply of boost energy for a period of time, which is great for getting around. The R1 and the L1 are still used for sidestepping, and holding both of them down will allow Sonic to parry attacks. As for the L2 trigger, hitting them anytime you're locked onto an enemy will cause the Hedgehog to use his range attack, the Sonic Boom, which is a volley of air-cutting projectiles. Now it should be noted that all of Sonic's buttons can be remapped to your liking if you don't like the default layout. But for me personally, I felt like the layout is fine as is. Yeah, the boost and the light speed button placement took some getting used to, but it wasn't so hard for me to make that adjustment. As you're running around these open zones, sometimes the perspective will shift from a 3D to a 2D if you interact with certain platforming sections that are scattered about. And when that happens, the physics as well as Sonic's handling will change. Furthermore, players can't leave these side-scrolling obstacle courses until they are fully completed. Try to keep this tucked away in the back of your mind, as I will be returning to the subject of these 2D sections later on. As for these platforming sections in general, I'm in the realm of indifference. On one end, these sections are pretty fun and immersive when they are weaved into the environment itself. Running along these ruin-like structures that are jetting out of the rock formation, or going from a natural trail on the ground to ending up in a temple filled with twists, loops, rails, and springs feels like a sense of exploration that belongs in a Sonic game. But on the other hand, you come across these random obstacle courses that just pop out of nowhere and remain suspended in the air. Sure, you can argue and say that we've seen this all the time in every Sonic title as well as other platform-heavy games, but the reason why it can be jarring is due to the fact that it can feel out of place in most areas. Here you are just running around in an open environment and boom, random obstacle course. It's not even attempting to mesh with the rest of the environment either, it's just there. While I don't really have too big of an issue with their existence, as they do prevent these zones from feeling too empty, which is a symptom I found in a lot of open style games like these, the execution is a tad bit sloppy with how they can be presented at times. But jarring platforming courses aside, Sonic himself when he's running around in this open environment handles like a dream. You can parkour off of certain structures, move like the wind without any real issues, and with that added momentum slider in the recent update, this allows Sonic to keep all of his momentum when he jumps, and trust me, this makes a huge difference in the overall experience. In fact, adjusting that slider should be the first thing you do before you start playing. I promise you will have an amazing time. Now let's move on to that combat. Sonic has been blessed with the power to effectively throw hands with the enemies he will encounter. Similar to how Shadow fought his enemies back in 06, Sonic will perform a rapid fire series of punches and kicks, and players can influence which direction Sonic will move at the end of his combo. His moves can be expanded upon as he levels up, giving him access to more devastating attacks that can allow Sonic to quickly dispatch his foes. And that right there is a key word: quickly. Not only all of Sonic's moves are flashy and fit the mold of how Sonic should fight, but he also makes quick work of his enemies. The battles feel both fluid and snappy, plus they are easy enough for anyone to pick up on. Best part is, each of the different enemies you encounter will require the player to approach them differently, as the same strategies won't work on every single enemy. Some will require Sonic to break their defenses first, while others fare better if you stick with his ranged attacks. Once you really get the hang of his moveset, even the most beefiest robos will go down in a matter of seconds. And that feels satisfying because it shows a sense of mastery, which is something that's always been synonymous with Sonic games in general. If you want speed, it must be earned, and the game's combat reflects this. My only gripe with the combat is that the camera will go into this dynamic cutscene when Sonic does any of his special moves, which can make the combat feel very sporadic. The latest update does give you the option to turn these cutscenes off, which makes the combat flow much better. But now that the combat is covered, let's get into that gameplay loop. Before Sonic can do anything, he needs to spend time collecting memory tokens in order to not only save the individuals that are held captive at the current island he's on, but you also need them to unlock certain sections of the area so Sonic can get to where he needs to go. It's pretty much like any other collectathon you see in other platformers, like the first Jak and Daxter, just to give an example. You can get these memory tokens by defeating enemies, exploring the land, or randomly drawing side loops in the middle of nowhere, as these can sometimes spawn from the ground. Clearing various platforming sections will be your main method out of all of these, and once you collected enough, just talk to the friend in need and keep on moving, because these memory tokens are not the only thing you need to keep track of. You also need these portal gears, which are mainly earned by defeating the mini bosses. Like regular enemies, each of these mini bosses are unique and requires a different strategy to beat them. They also feel more like standard boss fights from other Sonic games, as you can't just brute force your way through them either. Basically, you need to play their game and set up your win condition before you can go on the offensive. This can range from racing along the trail it leaves behind until you catch up to it, or hitting certain areas to expose its weakness. Then you need to use your best attacks to take them down before they have a chance to recover. If you're skillful enough, you can end these fights in one cycle even at lower levels. Once they are defeated, they'll drop those portal gears I mentioned earlier, which are needed to access the cyberspace stages. Now these stages is where you can say the other half of the game is, as this is where Sonic will play more like a traditional game using the boost formula. Despite the stages cycling through 4 different visual aesthetics, which is Green Hill, Chemical Plant, Sky Sanctuary, and a digitized city, each of the stage layouts are different from each other. The level designs for the 3D stages are taken straight out of Sonic Adventure 2 and Unleashed, with some original designs sprinkled in. Depending on who you ask, this can be seen as either a good or a bad design choice. On one end, these reused levels function nicely for what they are, and they're almost guaranteed to give the player a good time, especially if they are fond of these stages to begin with. On the other hand, there are players out there who are tired of seeing the same stuff and want to experience newer designs instead, especially since both Generations and Mania did the exact same thing, but better, as those stages were at least reimaginings instead of being ripped straight from the game itself. Me personally, I'm indifferent to these levels being reused because none of that matters if the Hedgehog's overall handling isn't living up to the hype, which is what I'm about to address right now. Unlike how Sonic handles in the open zones, the Hedgehog's speed will be reduced no matter how high his speed stat is, which can lead to situations where Sonic may be boosting, but it doesn't feel like he's going as fast as he could. Furthermore, Sonic overall feels stiff. Turning takes 10 years to do when you're boosting, discouraging players to use his boost in areas where you'd think he'd be okay. Jumping and trying to change your direction can feel like a chore, and sometimes he will struggle to make even the simplest of movements, forcing you to cook on the fly when you're trying to get that S rank. And Sega, when I said bring back drifting, this is not what I had in mind. I never would have imagined that fake drifting would actually become a thing. Now granted, I still had my own level of fun playing these stages, but this was after I got used to the game's physics engine. Just because I got my weight up does not excuse the game for having awkward controls, as not everyone is going to have the patience to do the exact same thing. I really need to ask, how did Sega manage to nail the boost formula in previous games like Generations, but fumble the bag here? No, better question. How did Sega manage to nail Sonic's handling in the open zones as far as the 3D spaces are concerned, but drop the ball when it came to the cyberspace stages?
I'm wildly inconsistent.
These are not the worst physics I've come across in a recent Sonic game, but I'm not going to ignore the fact that the physics engine for the 3D cyberspace levels are in need of some polishing. The 2D sections do not get any better. In fact, they're even worse. Not only is Sonic's sense of speed cut even further, but he's also severely lacking a good chunk of momentum, making these 2D sections feel very sluggish. Even when Sonic is boosting, it doesn't feel like he's running any faster, rather he's running with a lot of resistance. Granted, this was done in both Unleashed and Generations, but in those games, it didn't feel like he was running with weights strapped to his legs. When you boosted in those 2D sections, Sonic felt like he picked up speed and retained a sense of momentum, whereas here, it does not feel like that at all. This is why anytime I have to do these 2D stages, I try to get through them as efficiently as I can so I don't need to return to them ever again. And mind you, this is coming from someone who went out of their way to S-rank every last cyber stage in the game, as well as complete all of their objectives. So why do you need to bother with these stages anyway? It's because this is your main method to acquiring the keys to the Chaos Emeralds. When you clear a stage, you can acquire a number of these at a time if you manage to meet certain level conditions upon doing so, such as getting all of the red rings, meeting a certain ring count, and achieving an S rank. You can also repeat these stages as many times as you like, as Sonic has unlimited lives. If you want to make finding any of these collectibles easier or other points of interest, you definitely want to fill out more sections of the map by clearing the small challenges presented by these map nodes. Most of these challenges are extremely easy to do and can be cleared in a matter of seconds, plus they will reward you with an attack or defense seed along with filling out your map chart. So you want to do those as soon as possible. Doing so will give Sonic the ability to quick travel using the portal gates, which is always nice to have. Also, here's a small tip. If you find yourself unable to get to a certain point in the zone, just proceed with the story. You'll save yourself a lot of trouble if you do. Now, while you're in the process of getting those Chaos Emeralds, sometimes you're required to help these little stone-like creatures who call themselves Cocos. These little guys are important to the story, and for spoiler reasons, I won't say more than that. These little ones need your help filling out their mandatory tasks, which are not difficult at all and can serve as a small break from the regular game progression, but if you ask me, I kind of find them to be more of a pace breaker that just gets in the way of things. While I do care about what happens to them in the story upon completing their task, it shouldn't be at the expense of sucking me out of the most enjoyable parts of Frontiers. However, it is amusing when Sonic is pulling off his dance moves every time he clears these assignments. These same Cocos are also another collectible, as you can find them wandering around any ruin that you may find. Taking them to one of the Elder Cocos will increase one of Sonic's stats of your choosing, which is his speed or his ring count, both which are really important to have. The speed stat increases how fast Sonic will move when he's boosting, meanwhile if you increase his ring count, it will allow Sonic to hold more rings, as he will be able to take more hits as he does not drop all of his rings upon taking damage. It will also allow him to maintain a certain form for long periods of time. There are also these special Cocos you can find after clearing a difficult platforming section. Taking these to the same Elder will extend Sonic's boost meter, so it's worth going out of your way to seek them out. But hold up, what about his attack and defense stat? Do the Cocos increase that too? Nope, that requires two different collectibles, these being the attack and defense seeds respectively. You can get these by defeating enemies, clearing map nodes, and sometimes making random side loops which will cause them to appear too. If you take it to the other Elder, it can increase Sonic's attack, which will let him deal more damage, and his defense, which will make him drop less rings. Now once you got everything you need, you'll finally be able to take on the Titan, which is the main boss on the island you're currently on. You'll start these fights off as Sonic and make your way up to where the last Chaos Emerald is located, which is usually somewhere on the Titan's body. Then once you gather that last emerald, you'll be able to transform into Super Sonic and the real fight begins. Now I need you to let this sink in. For the first time, you are not waiting until you get to the end of an extra campaign. You are not waiting until the final climax of the main story, or even going through the trouble of unlocking him, which is usually not until you get through a huge bulk of the game anyway. Unless you're playing Sonic 2. You are able to play as Super Sonic as early as the first boss. But that ain't all they did to him. They even gave Sonic a moveset where you're able to go full DBZ on these Titans instead of just flying into their bodies like you normally would. This is the first time we get to see just how powerful Super Sonic really is and get the full extent of his strength right at our fingertips, complete with some Devil May Cry music blaring in the background while giving these Titans that shonen style beatdown. This right here is how these modern supersonic fights should be done. However, being the type of player I am, I will always try to figure out a way to exploit these fights, and it did not take me long to figure out how to do it. If you unlock any of Sonic's powerful combat moves, particularly his loop kick, you can cheese every single Titan by getting close enough to their face and spamming this one move over and over and over again. This same tactic also works on the final boss. You still have to do the occasional button prompts as they come, but after that, just keep kicking them until they go down. But despite the fact that these bosses can be cheesed, this is still a wicked feat that I never thought we'd be able to see. Supersonic with a fleshed out moveset in every boss fight instead of just the final battle in space. What a time to be alive. Now after that Titan goes down, it's on to the next island where you pretty much have to start over from scratch. Since all of the portal gears, keys, and memory tokens are different for each island, you can't carry any over extras you may find. So it's time to repeat the whole process until you beat the game. Aside from completing everything that has to do with the main game, there are several additional things that Sonic can do on each of these islands. He can collect more memory tokens which will allow him to view extra scenarios with his friends and flesh out their characters more, or go fishing with Big and break the game in half with all the prizes you can exchange there. Nah, seriously, this game becomes an absolute cakewalk when you spend at least an hour in there. Sonic can also hunt down these music notes which will let the player listen to other music across all the Sonic games while exploring the main islands, and even take on these active chain challenges. When you S rank these, Sonic will eventually unlock his Spin Dash, a move that finally returns to modern Sonic after so long. Keep in mind, some of the stuff I mentioned just now was not in the base game. These are free updates that was added later, which is why I held off talking about this game as long as I did. And with the added ability to adjust how much Sonic is able to keep his momentum when jumping, Frontiers right now feels like a whole new game compared to what it used to be. So for those who already experienced everything Frontiers had to offer and didn't play the game until these updates happened, a second playthrough from scratch might be warranted. Now, as much as I like to continue giving Sonic Frontiers its praises, the game does trip on its feet from time to time, and cyberspace is not the only time when this happens. To start, remember when I told you to keep those 2D platforming sections in the back of your mind? Well, we're going to revisit that subject because out of all of these issues I'm going to bring up, this is the biggest one. When you come across these 2D platforming sections in the open world, Sonic's handling will change drastically and not for the better. All of the issues that exist in the 2D cyberspace stages are repeated here in the open zone versions, but to a lesser extent because Sonic does have a decent sense of speed here compared to how he is in cyberspace. It's still pretty annoying to deal with it because you're going from having a highly enjoyable experience to then having that joy taken away from you every time you come across these segments in the game. Worst part is, you have to complete them if you want to regain good controls again or purposely fall out of bounds. In the first two islands, I didn't mind this too much because these platforming sections, as annoying as they can be, were fed to you in small doses. Once you reach Chaos Island, however, these 2D sections are practically everywhere, which sapped the fun right out of exploring. I often found myself avoiding these springs or dash pads during my run through Chaos Island simply because the chance of encountering these things was likely going to happen if I decided to use them. And even then, I still somehow ended up getting trapped in these side scrollers that I wanted no part of. The reason why these 2D sections are such a big issue is because Sonic Frontiers' main selling point is to have the freedom to run everywhere with solid controls and giving the player plenty of ground to go wild. Having these 2D sections completely interrupts that flow and discourages players from having the freedom to roam around, knowing they're going to be trapped in these clunky sections without a moment's notice. Especially on Chaos Island. I can't even sugarcoat it. Chaos Island is like a big middle finger to this entire game. Sonic games are known for having their difficulty spikes all the way back since the Genesis days. Some of those can be fixed with a skill issue adjustment, while others may require a little outside help. But then there are those few that simply exist because of bad design. And that is where Chaos Island falls under. Along with the issue of having these 2D sections placed everywhere, the initial problem lies with Chaos Island's structure. In the earlier and later islands you visit, one trait they all had in common is that they are one massive island that Sonic has no issues covering on his own. Even if certain areas of the land was closed off, doing the necessary back and forth outside of using the fast travel system was seamless. Well, Chaos Island tries to shake things up a bit by splitting that island apart, requiring the player to travel from one place to the next. And the main method of travel is going through these lengthy rail segments. Granted, you may not have to backtrack between these little segments if you use the fast travel system, but that depends on whether or not these segmented areas have landmarks which will allow you to use that to begin with, as you cannot fast travel to every major landmark. The missions you have to complete with the Cocos on this island is also quite annoying compared to the others the game had you complete up to this point. And just when you thought you was able to leave this awful place behind you after you've gathered all the required collectibles to close out this awful chapter, Chaos Island delivers one last you in the form of this giant pinball minigame, which, as you guessed it, is mandatory. Seeing Sonic in a pinball setting is nothing new. He has a whole game dedicated to that on the Genesis, and several titles have made nods to his pinball adventures, like the casino stage in SA1 or Bango Highway from Heroes. So seeing them pull something like this in Frontiers is an obvious homage to his previous pinball adventures. And at first, I was highly amused by this until I saw the obnoxious score they require players to achieve if they want to clear this minigame. No, your eyes are not deceiving you. That is a whopping 5 million points they expect you to get with only 3 lives to work with. And my first initial thought when I saw this number was, this is needlessly excessive. Now, if you're like me and you weren't blessed with the genes of a pinball wizard, this minigame may take you a while to clear. In fact, it took me a good 2 hours due to losing all of my lives and having to restart all of my progress. The point accumulation is sluggish even if you were to hit some of the key bumpers on this pinball machine. And the only way to speed that up is by collecting as many red rings as possible so you can increase your multiplier. The problem is, if you happen to lose 1 life at any point when you are playing, your multiplier will drop down to 0 and you'll need to build it back up again. If you lose all 3 of your lives during this minigame, you'll need to start over from the beginning. Once you finally reach this astronomical score, all you need to do at this point is send Sonic right into the blue clearing that will activate upon doing so. If you lose all of your lives when you're trying to attempt to do this, however, guess what that means? You'll still need to start this entire minigame over from scratch. I want to know who thought this was a good idea. The entirety of the Chaos Island arc is a huge mess, minus the Titan you fight against, which had a very satisfying ending to its battle, especially if you love playing Sonic in the Black Knight. Chaos Island is home to many problems I've had with this game, from experiencing these issues to small doses to having a full course meal of all the problems at once. The game at the very least does go back to being enjoyable once you get past this travesty, which is a shame because as a concept, Chaos Island has a really neat aesthetic that reminds me of Punk Hazard from One Piece, seeing as how it has the whole fire and ice theme going on. Finally, with all the highs that I've brought up and the lows that I've slammed down, it is time I answer the question which is also the title of this video. Did Sonic Frontiers restore my faith in Sega? The short answer, not right away, but it's a good start. Aside from those weak points that I brought up earlier, Sonic Frontiers managed to do a very important thing, and that is to provide Sega with enough groundwork to build on this new idea and make a better version of it should they decide to make a new game using this formula. Frontiers feels like an actual Sega title. And what I mean by this is that you can see the level of ambition and experimentation that went into this game, doing exactly what Sega is known for. Now, what I'm about to suggest can be seen as a major hot take, but the next time Sega makes an open zone title like this, or rather, a 3D Sonic title in general, they should completely remove the 2D sections. Looking back at everything I brought up, the most fun I had in Frontiers is when I'm running running around in a full 3D environment, and this goes for both the open zone and some of the 3D cyberspace stages. As I stated earlier, when the physics work in the 3D environments, they work very well, and Sega has displayed numerous times in my experience with this game that they are definitely capable of doing it. Now that I think about it, we had not had a full 3D Sonic game since Sonic and the Black Knight, and that was all the way back in the Wii era. All I'm saying is, Sega needs to focus on the strongest aspects of Frontiers, which is the 3D gameplay with the right physics that worked, by the way, and kick the 2D stuff to the curb. In fact, they're already coming out with a Sonic title that will be in 2D anyway, so I say it's time for a full 3D game to return the form. I firmly believe that if they can commit to that idea and execute it well, the next 3D title they release with the Frontiers format in mind will likely become one of the greatest experiences a Sonic fan can ask for. The third entry to Spark the Electric Jester, a game I will talk about in the future, is what I would say is the perfect template for the type of game I'm talking about, where momentum is earned in a full-on 3D setting, and even using a boost mechanic of its own, complete with great level design that fits what this game is trying to do. And there's not a 2D section in sight, so there's proof that it can be done. But as of now, with the new updates to improve on Frontiers experience, a massive DLC on the horizon, and a brand new game that is going to put a huge spin on the classic style gameplay, the future of Sonic games is promising, and I hope Sega keeps that momentum going. Anyway, that is all I have for today. If this video is way past cool, hit me with that siggity sub and make sure you hit that like button, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace!